Time to speed things up a little bit. In this belt and pulley bag, they have a little Allen key. In this piece where you're assembling like a gantry thing, it says to use M3 by 16. Now in my kit, I think I only had M3 by 18 and not 16. And the 18s were actually a little bit too long, and it hit this upper part after this square nut. So I had to use 3M10, 10 millimeter long. It's just barely long enough, but it does get into the entire nut right there. Don't over tighten it, it's wood. Well, it slid off, hit the floor, and these tiny little ball bearings went, well, I guess everywhere. Not all of them fell out, I'd probably only say that like 20% of them did. But I tried to put it back on thinking, oh, there's a whole lot of bearings, it probably doesn't need all of them, but sure enough, I tried to put it back on, and after a few failed attempts, it didn't slide nearly as well as when it was first on there. So, luckily I think I found most of them. There's probably still one or two, and I think I see one over there. I'll show you how these go back in, I suppose. So, generally a good way to do it is to just get like a little magnetized tool bit. Like, not super magnetized, but it's like if you've been working on things long enough like I have, your tools just become magnetized for whatever reason. So you just sort of pick it up on the end like this, get it on like the flat end of it, and there's like this little retaining clip in there. If you just get it like right in there, this little retaining clip, it like flexes a little bit. It's almost like a paper clip. You see it flexes. It just sort of maintains the bearings in there, which is probably one of the reasons why they didn't fly everywhere. But sliding it back onto the rail is pretty tricky. I find that the best way to do it without losing your marbles is to leave this upside down and try to slide this in. Essentially what I do is I just look down the rail and try to get it aligned with the first thing and just sort of look. And if they start to bunch up and get out of the rails, just sort of back off a little bit and like sort of just ooch it. And you see if I just sort of gently try to push these down, you see how the backside advances? That means that it's contiguous all throughout the back side of this block, so I know there's no gaps back there. So I can look at this gap, and if this gap is, and this gap is the same on both sides, and if this gap looks the same as the one on the bearings I'm trying to find, then that means I have most likely found them all. So this is what it should look like. You see these little screws here, these little Phillips head screws here and here. If you loosen them a little bit, I believe it adjusts how tight the bearings are along the sides of the rail. Okay, you see how those 4 screw holes that don't have screws in them are kind of countersunk? They're not countersunk enough. Basically, whenever I tried to mount the rail like that one linear rail down there to the other one, the heads of the screws sort of bump into what I'm trying to mount it to. Basically, these need to be deeper, so I have to drill them out a little bit. Whenever this is attached here, it doesn't thread through the threads like it did on the previous printer and on most Mark 8 extruders. You actually tighten up a set screw in here that goes down onto the neck of this threaded hot end. Now, the screw that was already in there, the little grub screw, set screw, whoever you want to call it, you know, this really tiny one, the hex was a bit worn out, but luckily in these, there's like lots of places for these set screws to go, and they're all the same size, so I took the one out that wasn't holding in anything. It was right next to the thermistor, the thermal sensor, and I moved it here, and the hex head on that was a lot more effective with this 1.5 millimeter driver. So that's how I tightened this in. Now, it's not perfect. I do kind of prefer using the threaded side and then like using a second bolt to tighten it up, but that's how this one recommended it, and I could see how it could be better in the future with like changing things out, but thought I'd let you know. Between the heatsink and the fan, I added these little nylon spacers that they included in the kit. They had a bunch of them. Not sure where else they would be, but I used the slightly longer nylon spacers. And basically what this does is it gives it, if you imagine it like this, this screw squeezes this, and you want pressure on your heatsink here, but if you don't have this nylon thing in here, this fan will want to like tilt upwards, and it's like doesn't tighten properly, and it's generally just sort of like not good. I'm getting way too entertained by this. This is the cable chain. So one thing, this little mount here for the cable tie, it should be facing to the left of the printer, because otherwise the cable chain doesn't go in the right direction. Like the physical thing, it's too far recessed for this button to actually be able to push the thing, which is an important part in navigating the interface. So what I did, I just took a small piece of tissue paper and wedged it down in there to act as a little stopper. And if you get just the right amount in there, you can set it on there and it'll still spin just fine. It'll be a little more loosely attached on there. You can see it does press. So I think I'm going to keep it like that. Early in the directions it said to put this switch in here, and it says to solder to it afterwards. I would recommend soldering to it before you put it into the box, because whenever it's inside there, it's really difficult to solder to these connections. Now, you could use crimp-on connectors, and that would probably be a little bit better, and also probably, well, easier to do once it's in there, but I don't really have those, so I am going to solder to it when it's outside of the case. So one thing I would also like to mention, 2 of these wires coming from the hot end assembly down the cables and into here were a bit too short, mainly the thermistor and the fan. So what I did to combat those, I basically just got some of the extra wire that there was in the kit, heat shrunk tube them to the end of it after removing the connector, and for the thermistor, I took the connectors, the little pins, out from one of the spare stepper motors and soldered it to the end because I really only needed that little extra bit. There's actually a rather nice wiring schematic here that shows basically where everything hooks up to. I would recommend looking at this, like if you're ever unsure about anything, where to go, because I mentioned earlier how there wasn't anything about wiring up the LCD. There is right here, right there. The main cooling fan for the electronics, well, the one that they included, it just had a terrible rattle. Luckily I had a replacement that was the same size, but just listen to this. Now, that may sound minor, but it's like, it seems like the fan speed just increases slightly, and it just becomes this really annoying kind of sound. Alright, so, mesh removed with extreme precision, of course. Wow. Okay. That made a huge difference. Yeah, that's so much better. Do that if you want your printer to be quiet. Now when I plugged it in, it got recognized as like FT-5 something, and it said on my computer it didn't have the driver for it, so I had to go to the FTDI website in order to find the new drivers for it. I googled the board, found the page for it on RepRap, and went to see how to get the firmware for it. And I had to install a new virtual COM port driver. Now, I'm linking in the description the place where you can download that. Download the executable because it's way more simple. But this is something that I should let you know because it was not in the directions at all. It just assumed that your computer would recognize it, and it did not do that for me. So you need to update your drivers. Basically the final stage of completion, but I either misplaced, completely lost, threw away, or they just weren't included. I do not have the heat sinks for the little driver boards in there. I have no clue where they went. So I'll cut it here. There we go, 4 little heat sinks.